Okay, 26th of July, 2025 happens to be the 150th anniversary of the birth of one Mr. Carl Jung. And it's just another day, but I am trying vainly to approach a discussion of the transcendent function and the uniting symbol in terms of the Eastern analogies which Jung uses in the and discusses in chapter 5. However, there's something else going on here. And so today I want to go a little more slowly and tackle the same problem that I'm wrestling with from different angles. I want to draw together a few threads before I do anything else. Drawing from Viveki and from Schmachtenberger, we're in a predicament. There's a situation, and we've been we can take from Schmachtenberger and Jordan Hall to notice that we've actually been in that situation or predicament for a very long time. It's not, capitalism is not the problem. It's more like Daniel puts it as the invention of stone tools creates overshoot dynamics that lead to overpopulation, and stone tools are circa 3.4 million years ago. And so there's a basic observation there. Again, if we take from Marvin Harris, infrastructure, social structure, superstructure, which is kind of like very briefly, infrastructure is kind of what everything is made out of. Like, do we have circular economy kind of thing? Social structure is like, what are the institutions, science, law, governance, etc., medicine that are, what are we up to? Um, and the superstructure is like, what are the guiding values, virtues, religions, philosophies, culture, essentially. And um, if Daniel talks about recursive abstraction, so for example, chimps do not create sharper tools. They will use a sharp knife if you give it to them, but they don't pass on that knowledge through culture. And they don't understand the abstract principle of sharpness to intentionally create. Um, Interestingly, if you look at you know, um, for example, um, making stone out of flint, this is a very old, um, there's a sort of morphic resonance to this pattern of behavior, which is extremely ancient. Um, it's deeply built into us, this um, pattern, actually. Not that we realize that because we don't make stone tools at the moment. But it's this an action, especially in relation to the earth, right? And the material, the matter, which comprises that earth of cutting, breaking, cleaving, dividing. And that is to come out of that kind of an energy um, or intentionality is a choice. And if it isn't compensated by a counteractive tendency toward wholeness, meaning joining, binding, reunifying, then we see imbalance. And particularly we see that this intentionality of cutting and dividing and splitting is it's connected with the idea. So the idea of sharpness, let's say. There's a implicit with that intention is the idea that something can be improved, that it can be made better, that it can be more sharp or sharper. And by better we mean better in terms of form. It's about creating form, right? The form of the tool. It's about shaping matter into form in a creative process. The form is not already given, it is imagined. So the problem that I'm working on here is from Daniel. Yeah, I'm trying to summarize it briefly by saying something like we need a compensating advance. We need a kind of some kind of cultural enlightenment if we're to avoid extinction. And I have an abiding faith, I guess it is at this point, that it's I notice about myself and people that I will care for myself ongoingly. I will care for myself ongoingly. I will care for myself ongoingly. And even if we have doubts about which I certainly do, about the viability, the worthiness, the meaning of life, what is it all for, and is it good? You know, I notice out of my humility that I'm not in a position actually to evaluate that, and that there is much suffering, but that how we show up in the world has a determining effect on how bad that suffering is, and indeed how much, goodness, truth, beauty, etc., meaning are to be found in the world. So how we show up really, really matters. And based on that observation and from out of the humility, we're not in a position to evaluate life in its entirety, but rather have the choice of participating in life or not. And I observe that at the deepest level, I and we indeed do participate in life from out of the faith and indeed the choice. I will care for myself ongoingly. I will care for myself ongoingly. I will care for myself ongoingly. And where there are questions, they come from they're detached from that usually. And I've forgotten how I got to that. So I want to say from there that, yes, that was the background to my, let's say, faith. It's a faith based on observation. not only observation. This is my version of, it's not that existence is good, it's that I don't know. I think there's a Luciferian pride which says existence shouldn't be. And I think that is prideful because one isn't in a position to evaluate existence. One is in a position to evaluate one's own existence. But because of the fact of multiple perspectives, one must admit that there are many experiences which are possible, and that how we show up in life, and indeed how we choose to condition ourselves, since we do actually have agency over the conditioning process, makes literally a world of difference. Such that certainly it's not that being is good from all perspectives, but that it is possible to create our own perspectives from which it can be seen that being is good. I could expand on that further at a different time, but just to say this is the basis for working on behalf of life in the faith or trust that something truly worthy of the potential of this human realm can in fact be created, and to do what I can for that. For the sake of the unborn and for the dreams of everyone living, and for the 3.5 billion years of successfully reproducing life who have passed the torch to us. I would consider it certainly an abdication of responsibility were we, and did I, not to show up on behalf of life and on behalf of the living force or power within us, which strives daily to care and to thrive and survive. From there, if we're correct about diagnosing at least some of the origins of the Metacrisis in terms of stone tools, those aren't the only relevant pieces. We have to work out how to create complex rather than complicated systems. And let me clarify a couple of other pieces. We also need an anti-rivalrous basis for coordination. So we have to work out how to build complex anti-fragile stuff and choose not to exploit all exploitable areas of the earth. We have to internalize all the externalities of our actions, since it's much easier to externalize harm. And all that is very different than humans have showed up before. And because of these sort of design parameters, these are sort of conditions on what it will really require for what we call humanity to continue to exist. And again, I don't think of that as just humanity, because you see this environmentalist narrative that if we disappear, then everything's groovy. You know, the earth continues on. And I don't find that model of the future to be compelling or attractive. there's a deep interrelationship between ourselves and the world, and what we call humanity is an emergent property of the world. The world, in its highest potential, I believe, requires the existence and success of what we call humanity. And indeed, orienting towards an omni-win solution looks like working for the thriving of all life, all beings in perpetuity, which is essentially the Bodhisattva imperative. What we can see there is that this survival imperative, really, and not just survival, really requires an enlightenment or bust. Analysis. Like things have to radically change in terms of human culture. Um, Again, there are other people working on how to do circular materials economy and how to do, you know, finance, law, and governance better and like more regeneratively. For example, in the context of um, civium, and those aren't my areas of expertise. What I have facility for is working out an anti-rivalrous basis for coordination and for working on the cultural and superstructural aspects of this change that is required. And I really think as well that small groups of humans change the world, and it's not about convincing or persuading anyone. It's about working out new codes, a new pattern, a new center of life from which to orient ourselves. And so we have actually a lot of the means, but we lack in some way the will. We lack the right intention to shepherd humanity away from all of the pitfalls which beset us. So the idea is to find a way to connect us more deeply with the source of life. Ongoingly. That could in some way reverse engineer enlightenment, as Viveki puts it. So there's an observation that we are, quote, unconscious. And that by getting to know ourselves better, by revealing a deeper intimacy between who we are and what reality is, that we can recognize ourselves more clearly. To intentionally bring ourselves into greater awareness, an awareness of what is, an awareness of who we are. And that involves ongoingly deeper participation in life. It involves changes to our normativity, to what we should do, to the choices we should make. It involves changes to how we live, how we ought to live. And changes in the truths which are available to us to be known. I'm talking about deep transformation that and that we understand the necessity to initiate ourselves collectively into deep transformation and hope to get that right. Now, I haven't yet made arguments using or drawing from Eliade, Michel Eliade, and Eric Neumann. So I will allude to them now by saying that I believe the origins of stone tools, about which I was speaking as a originator or generator of the situation of the metacrisis, I believe that that risk comes about as a result of a decline in culture. Namely, that the kinds of, let's say, Homo habilis that are, the types, let's say, let's assume types of people. Don't know if we want to say that they were people yet, but whatever. That they, I'm going to argue at different points that they may lack access to the appropriately ego dissolving mystical experiences in communion with nature, in communion with other people, and in communion with the mysterium tremendum. And that such communion, such regular, reliable, and potent, sufficiently potent access to ego dissolving experiences is a prerequisite for it's a condition of genuine culture or sustainable culture, I believe. And I will argue that in a different place. I'm stating it now. I think it was a decline in those forms of religiosity that led to the runaway dynamics that we see in stone tool proliferation. But I think other cultural prerequisites are required for the binding of creating technologies such as stone tools. Not only mystical experience, but also stories, myths, laws. And we could, for example, refer to indigenous scholarship and indigenous wisdom studies to confirm and justify that point of view. Tyson Yunkaporta comes to mind. We can also see that I believe that those indigenous attempts to bind or restrain technological proliferation with wisdom were in some ways inadequate. Because of the multipolar trap problems. And so we can see a need for even greater emphasis on the binding power of wisdom. And yeah. And so for me, there is a clear connection there from that binding power of wisdom to the imperative to reverse engineer enlightenment. But we can also see that it's not just about reverse engineering enlightenment, quote unquote enlightenment, and like refer to Viveki's work to understand how that can be scientifically or at least naturalistically defended as a. I mean, if there's any other, what kind of time are you looking for to look for a Hail Mary? Like we need a Hail Mary, and we don't have hundreds of years to achieve it. So I think there's a pretty fair basis for saying reverse engineering enlightenment is worth a shot. And so now I'm going to move into trying to specify a little, what is it about reverse engineering enlightenment? How does that connect with the stone tools thing? Well, we saw in stone tool making that there's an invention of a form. There's a creation of a new form. The form is not already given. It's imagined. Stone tools did not already exist. They're not natural phenomena. And this is important because it's the key break between genetic evolution and mimetic evolution, where instead of waiting to grow saber-toothed tiger fangs, we can create a spear, create a stone tool, and clothes and all the rest of our technological stack, which is a extremely rapid accelerator of evolutionary dynamics. And indeed, it's an exaptation of evolutionary dynamics into the cultural sphere. It's really the discovery of culture. I'm not reducing culture to stone tool making. I'm saying it's implied as well, and I'll discuss this at a different point in time when I talk about Neumann and Eliade, that in order for cultural transmission of stone tool making to exist, you need a number of other dimensions of culture already to be in place, like intergenerational knowledge transfer, for example. I'm not talking about that here. I'm focusing on the stone tools part and looking at what I'm trying to get at is the bit about imbalance in that form of creation. So I'm saying that the invention of stone tools is a kind of process which, if it is to be sustainable, must necessarily be balanced with an equivalent kind of process. What kind of process might that be? Well, that would require us to specify a bit more clearly what are these different processes. We can see some elements of it. When we create stone tools, there's a quality of using intention to split, divide, cut, break, natural forms for the sake of the creation, the invention of new or imagined forms in reference to an idea which is in potential. We can see there that elements of that correspond to the symbolism associated with the numbers 3 and 4, which I've spoken about. So what I'm going to be moving into is, again, as per episode 8 in this series, trying to understand this quote. 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 3, and from the third comes the 1 as the fourth. I believe that this quote refers to this rebalancing process. So the discovery or rediscovery of something ancient, or I don't know if age really applies to this process. What I mean by that is that it may have a quality of mediating between temporal and timeless, meaning not bound in time or space. Yeah. One of the trickiest things about that quote is that in the move from 1 to 2, we've tended for, I mean, 2 is a very deep phenomena, right? And it tends to show up and structure our thinking and our seeing, our being in the world. For example, when I've been trying to speak about the meaning of 3 and 4 in terms of that quote, I've tried to characterize 3 and 4 in terms that help us to distinguish them. For example, 3 is connected with the masculine, with pyramids, with the will, with striving, with transcendence in this context, with going with the Apollonian, with going up toward the idea, toward the abstract. It's connected with power, with strength, with ego identity, with self-determination, with the solar plexus chakra. And in contrast, the 4 is connected with the square or cube rather than the triangle or pyramid. And 4 with the feminine, the with so 3 would be logos and 4 would be eros. 4 is connected with nature rather than culture, with feminine rather than masculine, with the sort of et cetera, et cetera. The trouble is there that is a somewhat dualistic conception. You see what I mean? Where the component of that quote, which is the 2, the dualistic quality, recurs. And the reason for that is that it's built in to our being in the world. It's very where because there's a process that I am not very good at bringing into action yet. And I am stumbling toward improving my skill at that, which involves mediating between different pairs of opposites by engaging a specific process, which I'm in the process of rediscovering. As I'm doing that, this duality recurs. So, with that acknowledgement, if we allow me for the sake of explication, in the hopes that that will serve, if we allow me for the sake of explication to characterize 3 and 4 in those terms, we can then use that as a framing to apply to the example of the process of the creation of stone tools. So I want to suggest that the process of stone tool creation, as we understand it, certainly as I understand it, corresponds to one half or one version of the relationship between 3 and 4 that ought to be rebalanced or compensated with the equivalent degree of emphasis on the other half or the other version of their relationship. And to make that more clear, what I mean by that, I have to specify how stone tool creating corresponds to one half of their relationship. And so to begin that, I'm going to briefly review how I talked about this. 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 3, from the third comes the 1 as the fourth. All I want to say about it, it's not very long, just to say that there are dualisms that recur always, and that historically there was a split, there was a fall, there was a division, etc. And we're looking for a way to reunify, reintegrate, reconvene, come back to the source. And as I argued in the review in Dreams, I think as individuals, we want to come back to the source, but as a collective, we want to be born into separateness. So I won't talk about that now, but just to say it's not only about returning to the source, it's also about developmental progression so the progression in the development of the individual would be to reconvene with the source and to ameliorate the condition of being split off, cut off, atomized and separate. But that same developmental process could afford the individuation of collective humanity, quote unquote. The same process. And again, there's a review in the series on dreams that discusses that in more detail. So thanks to Jung, we talked about a mediating process that holds creative tension between any pair of opposites. And in terms of the quote that we're discussing from Maria Prophetissa, that mediating process is equivalent to the 3 and the 4, which are in some way the context within which any polarity, any dichotomy, any opponent processing between opposites or pairs exists or occurs. And so to hold that creative tension and talk about the 3 and 4, I'm here characterizing the 3 as I've already done, or as, at least as Jung has already done, in terms of the will. There is a will of some kind to hold creative tension. It doesn't say whose will, it says there is a will. There is some power or force. And again, we can see that will is connected with the solar plexus. But that quality of will of which I speak, there are several qualifications of it. It's connected. I can give you an example. I'll give you the example of two people, two human beings in a dialogue. There is a creative tension between them where each of them is coming from a different perspective. And so they're in a kind of binary system. And they exercise their free will, quote unquote, to begin and stay in and end that dialogue. Without that free will at their disposal, the dialogue would not occur. And so you could talk about that free will as a condition of the dialogue. I will qualify the free part of it in a second, but just to say that from there we can see that this free will is connected with the quality of spaciousness, because the dialogue between any two to be seen and defined as such must by definition take place and take place within a space. So for the dialectical or dialogical dualistic aspect of things to be noticed and indeed defined, there must be a space out of which that defining takes place. And one could simply argue, oh, that's the one. And there's a tricky part that, like, I'm trying to avoid the pre-trans fallacy by saying that the one that occurs at the end of the process it's different than the one that occurs at the beginning of the process. And it's kind of tricky because it's both the same and different. So I'm not going to talk about that here. I'm simply going to state that this space, as I've connected with free will, is connected more with the number 3 in the quote rather than the number 1. Now, Will, again, another quality of that will that holds creative tension between pairs of opposites is that it is always will to something. Will I think a constituent element of the will is directedness. Indeed, will to and will from. And Jung, as we indeed have discussed, talks about an impartial basis of the will. So he connects, for example, this spacious area that holds the creative tension between opposites, connected with free will, but it's also connected with the conscious will, our conscious intention to dispose our creative energy toward, for example, a dialogue. And that allows Jung to have the conscious half or component of one's personality correspond with 3, the conscious free will, and the 4 correspond with the unconscious. So it's the same symbolic category. The unconscious is there connected with the body, with nature, with the feminine, with the void. And the 3 is connected with the masculine, with the conscious, with the creative rather than receptive, and whatever the opposite of void is, like abundance or form rather than emptiness. Now, Jung talks about the will as requiring an impartial basis. For the will to serve properly as having the power of mediating pairs of opposites, it needs a proper direction. It needs a proper basis, according to Jung. And he feels that that direction or basis is toward the unconscious. Toward the unconscious. We can see there that in terms of the quote, again, 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 3. Imagine that and from the 3rd comes the 1 as the 4th. So if we take 3 to be imagine for the sake of argument that we take 3 to be the conscious directing, the conscious, willful, chosen, voluntary directing of the emergent property within Dialogos toward what is unconscious. imagine that focus or that orientation within dialectic into dialogos could in some way fulfill the prophecy of Maria Prophetissa. Her name literally is Prophetissa, so I'm speaking literally. Now, that's a first pass over the territory of how this quote could show up as a normative guide, a guide for the focus or the orientation within dialectic into dialogos that could be helpful. Very tricky territory to talk about here. From that point, I have to clarify, how is the process of stone tool making already extant? How does it correspond with a version of that process? And to do this, this is Jung in page 113 and 14, spoke of two different situations that refer to this dynamic between 3 and 4, of which we've been talking. He speaks about normal and abnormal conditions. And here, in order to aid us, I will quote Jung, and then we will talk about it because it's very, very tricky. Jung says, thus, besides the will, which is entirely dependent on its content, man has a further auxiliary in the unconscious, that maternal womb of creative fantasy. That would be the 4, whereas the will would be the 3. That maternal womb of creative fantasy. which is able at any time to fashion symbols in the natural process of elementary psychic activity. Symbols that can serve to determine the mediating will. I say can, as in can serve, advisedly, because the symbol does not of its own accord step into the breach, but remains in the unconscious, just so long as the energetic value of the conscious contents exceeds that of the unconscious symbol. Quote, under normal conditions, this is always the case. But under abnormal conditions, a reversal of value sets in, whereby the unconscious acquires a higher value than the conscious. The symbol then rises to the surface without, however, being taken up by the will and the executive conscious functions, since these, on account of the reversal of value, have now become subliminal. The unconscious, on the other hand, has become supraliminal, and an abnormal state, a psychic disturbance, has supervened. Under normal conditions, therefore, energy must be artificially supplied to the unconscious symbol in order to increase its value and bring it to consciousness. This comes about, and here we return again to the idea of differentiation provoked by Schiller. This comes about through a differentiation of the self from the opposites. This differentiation amounts to a detachment of libido from both sides, insofar as the libido is disposable. For the libido invested in the instincts is only in part freely disposable, just so far, in fact, as the power of the will extends. This is represented by the amount of energy which is at the free disposal of the ego. The will then has the self as a possible aim. And it becomes the more possible, the more any further development is arrested by the conflict. In this case, the will does not decide between the opposites, but purely for the self. That is, the disposable energy is withdrawn into the self. In other words, it is introverted. The introversion simply means that the libido is retained by the self and is prevented from taking part in the conflict of opposites. Since the way outward is barred to it, it naturally turns towards thought, where again, it is in danger of getting entangled in the conflict. The act of differentiation and introversion involves the detachment of disposable libido, not merely from the outer object, but also from the inner object, the thought. The libido becomes wholly objectless. It is no longer related to anything that could be a content of consciousness. And it therefore sinks into the unconscious, where it automatically takes possession of the waiting fantasy material, which it thereupon activates and forces to the surface. Schiller's term for the symbol living form is happily chosen because the constellated fantasy material contains images of the psychological development of the individuality in its successive stages, a sort of preliminary sketch or representation of the onward way between the opposites. Although it may frequently happen that the discriminating activity of consciousness does not find much in these images that can be immediately understood, these intuitions nevertheless contain a living power, which can have a determining effect on the will. But the determining of the will has repercussions on both sides, so that after a while the opposites recover their strength. The renewed conflict again demands the same treatment, and each time a further step along the way is made possible. This function of mediation between the opposites I have termed the transcendent function. By which I mean nothing mysterious, but merely a combined function of conscious and unconscious elements, or as in mathematics, a common function of real and imaginary qualities. Besides the will, whose importance should not on that count be denied, we also have creative fantasy, an irrational, instinctive function, which alone has the power to supply the will with a content of such a nature that it can unite the opposites. This is the function that Schiller intuitively apprehended as the source of symbols. So I'm going to invite you to replay that quote as needed, because now I have to move a little bit faster so that I can express myself. Again, I have an intuition that this is critically important. This is why I'm spending such time on it. Imagine the process of stone tool creating, right? Now, again, Jung has been talking about a condition in which there is a block. There is a conflict between opposites, and one cannot continue, quote, into the world or in life. Life cannot continue. There is a block in the progression of life. Imagine, a monkey without a tool. Imagine that it wants to eat. This is the continuation of life, right? Well, there is a block. It can't do that. At some point you know, in human evolution, let's say Homo habilis time, that block resulted in, as Jung is saying, there's a when there is that block of life, of the flow of life, of the progression of what Jung would call libido, there is a return to it. There is a one falls back on one's inner resources. So again, there's in the practical terms, if there is like for example, imagine a monkey and you see videos of this of like monkeys trying to get some grubs out of a stick and it can't, right? So it wants the food. There's a very clear goal that is involved in the very clear example of how life can move forwards if that, let's say, goal is achieved. And so the monkey is sort of beset with this problem and it falls back on itself because it's stuck, right? It can't go forwards in the outer world. Well, it falls back on one's own inner resources to think and scratch its head and wonder how. And it has an idea. It has an idea. And Jung would say, where exactly does that idea come from? Where exactly? And I think he would say from the self, from the creative unconscious matrix. So importantly, it's not exactly an idea. The outer conflict, he would say, regresses. It comes back to, instead of being outside in the quote real world, it comes within one into a state, and that one enters into a state of introversion. The conflict is introverted within. And so now there's conflict taking place within, there's a problem. And how is the problem resolved internally? Well, Jung describes this. He talks about how the symbol, there is a symbol which naturally arises. And like by extension, it's like, well, how does it naturally arise? And then he talks about how it has to do with the relationship between the soul and God internally. And I'm not going into that now because we're imagining with a monkey, and I'm right. So there's a symbol which emerges, and in that context, at that time, symbol and idea are essentially the same. There's an inner, it's a symbol, it's an insight, it's an idea, it's all of those things. There's a different argument at that point about how the unusual connections, the increased connectivity between brain regions precipitated by psilocybin ingestion built into behavior epigenetically via the Baldwin effect makes such insights more readily available. I don't want to say that it originates with the mushroom. But that's also aside for now. The point is, a symbol naturally arises within in this introverted condition. And that symbol resolves the conflict such that for the monkey has an idea of creating it. I'm wondering here if when the mediating symbol is, yes, I've got it. Okay. So this mediating symbol emerges from the depths, from the inner depths, from what Jung calls the unconscious. It emerges in the form of an image, a symbol, an idea, an insight. And so that results in an inner change in, well, this has to do with the psychology of insight, right? It's a change in understanding that we could talk about that like neuroanatomically in terms of new neural pathways open up. So again, just very briefly in terms of uh, four levels of knowing: participatory, perspectival, procedural, and propositional forms of knowing. Well, none of the propositions that the monkey had worked, and it didn't know how, it didn't have the right skill to proceed. It couldn't take up the right perspective to solve the problem. And so it kind of falls back on the participatory level by literally participating with or in the problem. So it's mulling on the problem. It's digesting, and this is connected with the digestive process, I want to say. You can also see how that's connected to psilocybin, but I'm not going to go into that. I'm saying that when the participation in that problem results in because it's an emergence from the depths, right? Or from the heights, but I'm connecting it here with the body. And so from the depths makes more sense to me. It's an emergent process. Um, that that insight, that symbol, that image, that idea is converted into the capacity to, so there's a transformation participating in the problem of life, the problem that besets one in life, results in the capacity to take up a different perspective on the problem, to develop a new skill from out of that perspective, and potentially, although probably not for the monkey, establish new propositions. Monkey hadn't got to that level yet. That's good. That allows us to see that from there, yes, the symbol, the insight, the image is then converted from an inner condition, symbol formation skill. So there's a process of symbol formation. There's then a process of symbol expression. So oneself is a being capable of mediating the process between symbol formation and symbol expression. importantly, the expression of that symbol can take different forms. So the symbol is itself an inner form invested with energy that has arisen from the depths. And that energy and the meaning of that symbolic form and the energy contained within it can be expressed creatively in different ways, such as we can imagine, such as the capacity to take up a new perspective, the capacity to create a new skill, the capacity to utter new propositions. So that symbol could be expressed in a verbal way, or it could be expressed by making a new tool. And that is exactly what we saw. I haven't thought about this, but it would be interesting to look at this place about what are the different available dimensions of reality for the expression, for that creative expression that I just named. Is it true that there are three that I just laid out? Because importantly, we can see the reason that that question is important is because we can see there that the process of stone tool creation is actually an instance or an example of the process that Jung is describing, namely the function of mediation between the opposites, which is termed the transcendent function. However, we also saw that that process of stone tool creation results in an imbalance. And that's what we need to talk about next.